Might have to let you just play that.
911 is a
All
joke.
right, then. All right. Once again, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm gonna do my best to see everybody as I talk. First of all, thank you for the introduction. I don't know, introductions have a way of making you feel honored, but also kind of old. So I'm trying to step into that still, and I'm still in denial. I will be turning 50 this year, but don't tell anyone. Thank you to Whitney and Tanya. Thank you both. It's endless labor to put something like this together. I appreciate the crowd that showed up for us. I appreciate the titling of the conference. I'll tell you all that one of the main questions I got from folks was, how the hell was there an abolitionist thing going on at UC DC, of all places, right? Where this place is ripe with CIA. I can say ripe with the ghosts of the Sandinistas and all kind of, I mean, just look at the photos on the wall, right? So it's a trip doing this here. But I'm also gonna say that it's also maybe somewhat ominous that we're doing this here. That's kind of the focus of my comments today. So I'm also, I have to say, I'm honored to be on the same roster as Dorothy Roberts and Sharice Burton-Stelly. Dorothy's books are already required reading for all of us. Sharice's book is going to be required reading for all of us. I'm gonna be, so you're gonna, I already told you, don't worry, you're gonna be coming to my grad seminar virtually or in person this fall because I'm assigning your book. So I can't wait, thank you. So I appreciate being on this with the two of you. I also want to just repeat, I'm proudly a faculty member. I'm not proudly a member of the University of California for reasons I'll talk about, but I'm very proudly a member of the new Department of Black Study because it came directly out of struggle, came directly out of a response to the insurgencies of 2020. And we're going to need your all's help to put pressure on the institution to do its job and provide the staff and infrastructure we need to actually make the department because they're already doing us dirty. So just heads up on that. And then finally, a heads up that there's a film forthcoming from co-directors Cynthia Martinez, who's here, and I saw you. So stand up for a second. Can you stand up? Thank you. I just want to recognize you. There's a film forthcoming from co-directors Cynthia Martinez and Setsu Shigematsu titled Abolish ICE in All Border Prisons. It'll be out this fall. The film tells the story of the Abolish ICE movement through the voices and experiences of feminist abolitionists and queer undocumented activists in Southern California who've been organizing to shut down Adelanto, the biggest migrant prison in California. I posted the trailer a few minutes ago on Twitter, on my Twitter feed, @Ellen Rodriguez. Full transparency, Setsu Shigematsu is also a person I'm married to, my spouse. So I talked about the film, now I can make sure I can go home. Okay, so let me get started. I hope you can hang with me for about 45 minutes. I want to start by saying that it might be helpful to again reflect on the durable framework outlined by Black revolutionary organizer and intellectual George Jackson in 1971. So, pardon me for just thinking through this with you. And I try not to put too much text on slides, but to bring us George Jackson's thought, I felt like it was necessary. George Jackson, at each crisis, the national cohesiveness of the United States was allowed to reform itself. With each reform, revolution became more remote. This is because the old left has failed to understand the true nature of fascism. We will never have a complete definition of fascism because it is in constant motion, showing a new face to fit any particular set of problems that arise to threaten the predominance of the traditionalist capitalist ruling class. But if one were forced, for the sake of clarity, to define it in a word simple enough for all to understand, that word would be reform. Of course, the revolution has failed. Fascism has temporarily succeeded under the guise of reform. The only way we can destroy it is to refuse to compromise with the enemy state and its ruling class. Yeah. Shout out to George Jackson. So I want to move within George Jackson's conceptualization here to consider the concept of counterinsurgency. Given us all, especially given that we're in DC, we're in UC-DC, we're in a building that is literally constituted through counterinsurgency. And I want to raise the question of whether and how some of the work we do, and I say we in the sense of this room, not a universal we, the we that is in this room, whether the work we do even as we aspire to call it abolitionists, may actually be entrapped within the carceral logics of counterinsurgency. On the one hand, counterinsurgency encompasses the logics of reform invoked in George Jackson's analytical definition. On the other, it also includes some of the very same critical practices, mobilizations, and movements that purport to resist and oppose what he calls fascism, which is to say the contemporary and ongoing zombie life of global anti-Black colonial racial capitalism. So I begin with a question for all of us. How does the logic of counterinsurgency animate and guide the curricula, art, organizing and research agendas, caretaking labor, epistemological frames, and even the political imaginations and aspirations of people and collectives who identify as progressive or otherwise committed to social justice, as well as those who embrace identification with abolition, decolonization, Black radicalism, abolition feminism, trans-abolition, and other radical and revolutionary streams? Asked another way, how do various forms of resistance to the violence, demoralization, and imposed vulnerabilities of criminalization, policing, and genocidal domestic war fall into the logics of counterinsurgency? I want to be clear, I mean this less as an accusation than as a guiding critical question for all of us who are engaged in nonprofit organizations, community-based campaigns, policy and rights-based advocacy, academic initiatives, and yes, conferences, and of course, scholarly research projects. So, rather than assume that the concepts of counterinsurgency, and for that matter, insurgency, are commonly understood, I think it might be helpful to think briefly through how these terms are actively weaponized through official definitions. Here's worth mentioning that the U.S. military's Counterinsurgency Joint Forces Manual, also known as Field Manual 324, is a widely circulated text with a readership that exceeds most New York Times bestsellers. The current version of Field Manual 324 has its origins in a thorough rewriting of previous versions that was released in December 2006. That 2006 version, as you see here, was downloaded more than 600,000 times within a day of its release, and over 1.5 million times in the ensuing month. Holy shit. For real, like that's, I can't get my mind around that either. I learned this figure a couple years ago, I still can't get my head around it. This mind-boggling number suggests that Field Manual 324 is far more than a military curriculum. It is also a popularly circulated text. Or perhaps it is a military curriculum that circulates as a popular text. According to the Counterinsurgency Joint Forces Manual, hang with me here, this is setting the grounds for everything else that I'm gonna talk through. Insurgency. Insurgency is the organized use of subversion and violence to seize, nullify, or challenge political control over a region. This echoes to some of the presentations I've already heard today, right? This is partly what abolitionists do, is insurgency, that work of insurgency. Insurgents can combine the use of terrorism, subversion, sabotage, other political, economic, and psychological activities, and armed conflict to achieve its aims. It is an organization of political military struggle by a predominantly indigenous group, lowercase I in this case, or movement designed to weaken, subvert, or displace the control of an established government for a particular region. All right, that's the US military's definition of insurgency. Counterinsurgency now. Counterinsurgency is the combination of measures undertaken by a government, sometimes with US government and multinational partner support, to defeat an insurgency. An effective counterinsurgency operation will utilize all instruments of national power to integrate and synchronize a holistic approach aimed at weakening the insurgents while simultaneously bolstering the government's legitimacy in the eyes of the contested population. So take that with you for just a minute. So by centering the concept of counterinsurgency, a few things come to mind. First and foremost, it's very obviously, very overtly a term of colonial warfare, a term of occupation, more precisely colonial and imperial planning and mobilization against resistance, disorder, insurrection, rebellion, guerrilla war from people who desire a repulsion of an occupying force or dominant power, including the police. To qualify this point, it's important to acknowledge that insurgent forces may come from anywhere in the imagined political spectrum, from reactionary fundamentalists to liberal democratic nation builders, to communist revolutionaries, to indigenous decolonizers, to Black liberationists, to anarchist abolitionists, to everything beyond and in between. Right? So counterinsurgency wants to liquidate and pacify any and all of it to the extent that it does not serve the needs and purposes of empire. Right? Just so I don't want to fall into the trap of just thinking we can say insurgency, we all mean the same thing. Right? Insurgency can mean lots of different things. Second, counterinsurgency is one paradigmatic expression of asymmetric warfare. While the term asymmetric warfare has fallen out of favor with many in the US military intelligentsia due to its definitional ambiguities, largely because military academics, they've kind of reached this general consensus that almost any war could be defined as asymmetric war, right? So nonetheless, I'm gonna go back to that term because I find it useful. I think a strategic appropriation of the term is useful here. And that's because contemporary domestic warfare, which I'm not going to periodize for us because I want to allow for robust and multiple interpretations and historical contextualizations. Contemporary domestic warfare, particularly on this continent, is asymmetrical in two senses. First, it is asymmetrical in terms of domestic warfare's method. The classical military definition of asymmetric warfare identifies the irregular, nominally unconventional approaches to waging war that take place when two or more forces with incommensurate military power engage in conflict. If there's such a thing as a classical definition of asymmetric war, it's one that identifies the tactics and strategies of those who are generally fighting from a condition of vastly inferior arms, personnel, training, and global political power. Asymmetric warfare in these conditions entails an identification of the superior and usually occupying military power's weaknesses and the strategic mobilization of indigenous resources, knowledge, and tactical capacities, as well as political will against the superior military power in ways that exploit that superior military power's weaknesses. In this sense, asymmetrical warfare includes things commonly identified, is particularly in the definition of insurgency I just read you from the field manual, as guerrilla warfare. It includes tactics like information disruption in this day and age, sabotage, of course, proxy war, as well as extensive community building, education, and organizing with civilians or nominal non-combatants. The second sense in which the concept of asymmetric warfare might be helpful to a discussion of counterinsurgency is in identifying the incommensurate casualties of a particular war, including asymmetrical subjection. I say asymmetrical because I'm tired of the term disparity. I'm tired of the term inequity. I'm tired of the term disparate. I think asymmetrical gets closer to it in the sense that sometimes you have figures and consequences and conditions that actually just can't be compared to each other. Right? So it's such a radical difference that it's just an asymmetry at that point, right? Like they can't even be put alongside each other. So I'm thinking here about asymmetrical subjection to death, illness, and suffering as a result of both normalized and spectacular state violence, right? So everything from just everyday policing to the move bombing. U.S. domestic warfare fits within this conceptualization of asymmetric war with the distinction that its primary agent is, of course, the U.S. state, which extracts targeted casualties through policing and criminal justice apparatuses, as well as the guiding platforms, rhetorics, and policy commitments of its mundane governance, including social welfare, as Professor Roberts taught us last night, compulsory schooling, as a bunch of folks here were teaching us today, and land development, as also a bunch of folks were talking about in the last 2 days. The asymmetric casualties of carceral war, for example, reflect why the canonization of the commonly used phrase mass incarceration is misleading and potentially dangerous. I will say we have to probably stop using that phrase. Right? And that's with all due respect to the fact that the origins of the phrase are largely actually in Black radical and Black abolitionist organizations that use the phrase mass incarceration, but they were talking about Black folks, right? I'm talking about how it's been, that term has been kind of appropriated, stolen, and held hostage by public policy think tanks, philanthropic organizations, academics, and others, who I think are sneaking a liberal universalism and asymmetric domestic war denialism in through the back door. Right, so I advocate just a boycott of at least for now, of the term mass incarceration, unless you want to be specific about who's being mass incarcerated. So I want to outline this notion of asymmetric war to further contextualize the question of whether and how the overlapping regimes, planning infrastructures, and public-facing rhetorical strategies, as well as the research agendas of nonprofit organizations, philanthropic foundations, academics, universities, and museums may work as counterinsurgency, in rhythm, if not entirely in coordination, with militarized forms of counterinsurgency like direct police repression, martial law, organizational infiltration, secret surveillance, political imprisonment, and assassination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to illustrate my point, I'd like to continue with a big fuck you to Darren Walker, president of Ford Foundation. Fuck you, Darren Walker. Fuck you, Darren Walker. I state this as a former 2-time recipient of the Ford Fellowship and graduate.
Wow.
Though notably, Walker has eliminated the Ford Fellowship. A bunch of y'all that are in grad school know this, right? And it's probably partly my fault, but there's a story behind this that I think makes sense. As a lot of you know, this Darren Walker, who weaponizes his black queer identity, by the way, right? He absolutely weaponizes that as president of the Ford Foundation to try to defend himself against certain forms of criticism from abolitionists, queer, abolitionists, black feminist people. So Walker supported New York City Mayor, then New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's 2019 proposal to shut down Rikers Island Jail, yay, but not really, because the point was to move all the people that were incarcerated in Rikers to 4 new jails that would be built across the New York City boroughs by 2026. So he writes this shitty essay called In Defense of Nuance, which you see up there. Don't read it. As a reaction against the protests that folks were mobilized around the Ford building. I very racially wrote a response to him, which Abolition Journal created that awesome graphic. That's a guy named Nick George Bundy, who you can read about in a book called Black Awakening in Capitalist America. I'm going to reference in a second. But Walker, you know, he moves in the tradition of Nick George Bundy. So yes, I wrote that in response to Darren Walker, which is probably why I'm not going to get too much Ford funding anytime soon. Not that I want it. So there were significant protests in New York City at the Ford Foundation building, led by abolitionists of all kinds, from all kinds of places: artists, scholars, graphic organizers, folks just got pulled into it, all kinds of folks. At the same time, and this is where I think it's echoing some of the points I wanted to raise with y'all today, the Ford Foundation, to this day, is known to fund research projects, nonprofit organizations, and non-governmental organizations that seem to be aligned with decarceration and even abolition. Prominently featured on its funding screen page, titled Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Justice, is the following statement. We support organizations led by formerly incarcerated or convicted people, so those most affected shape advocacy agendas and policies. We invest in grassroots efforts that build broad support for decarceration, including people with convictions, crime survivors, law enforcement, and business leaders. Not lying, still on the website, go check it out, or don't. So, I raised this prominent recent example of Darren Walker and the Ford Foundation to illustrate the logic of a condition that emerged over the last 15 or so years, largely as a reaction to the on-the-ground insurgencies and rebellions against the anti-Black violence of the U.S. state. Here I'm referencing what many of you have closely observed and participated in, including mobilizations of people in Ferguson, Baltimore, Houston, Washington, D.C., Oakland, Minneapolis, and now shout out to Atlanta and the mounting militant resistance, so-called Cop City. Now, of course, there's been an unsurprising spike of far-right proto-fascist reactions to these insurgencies. It's worth noting that a relatively tiny fraction of the membership of far-right groups like the Proud Boys have been selectively prosecuted by federal and local officials to showcase the U.S. state's supposed intolerance of right-wing hate groups. Yet, complementing the far-right reactionaries, this is my point today, there's also been a similarly predictable rise of what might be identified as a liberal progressive reaction to liberationist and abolitionist insurgencies. One key distinction between the liberal progressive reaction and right-wing reaction, however, is that the liberal progressive reaction is not prosecuted by the state, but instead tolerated, supported, and sometimes even funded by it. All right, so you're with me. I'm happy about that. I wasn't sure that was going to happen today. So this conference in some ways memorializes how we differently inhabit and respond to this period of liberal progressive counterinsurgency. Those referred to as academics. And I have a whole thing about trying to push back against the term in the aspirational identity of academic, and embracing the term of scholar, a thinker, of like artist, of writer, teacher, that kind of thing. I think academic is a colonial aspiration, but nonetheless, folks will refer to people employed by colleges and universities as academics, right? People like me, you know. I think those of us that are employed in those positions, who inhabit those positions, are entirely wrapped up in the liberal progressive counterinsurgency, right? So don't get it twisted. You know, I'm a longtime employee of the resiliently colonial anti-Black University of California, finishing my 22nd year as a faculty member. I'm only saying this because when I offer the analysis that I'm offering today, I do not offer it from a privileged outsider position. Right, I'm not getting on some kind of high horse and talking down to people about this. I'm talking from inside this thing. I'm talking from a position within the institutional logics and reward systems of the university. But I'm also talking from a position where I have dealt, because of my university, through the university, I've dealt with attempted criminal prosecution around 2003, 2004. I've dealt with gendered racist slander pretty much every day. Death threats to my person, my family, and my students. I'll show you the emails. And everyday liberal white supremacy that takes cover behind respectable academic discourse. You feel me on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in this job because generations of people, including the late James Turner, the late Barbara Christian, the late Clyde Woods, and many others, created semi-autonomous spaces under conditions of acute hostility and constant low to high intensity violence. So I dare to speculate that some of us here might relate to this condition in your own ways within your own institutional organizational sites. So, as you and I situate our own positions relative to both asymmetric domestic war and the violence of the university, and for that matter the nonprofit industrial complex, I'm guessing that an ominous feeling sets on. This is the feeling that the reach and influence of liberal progressive counterinsurgency is overwhelming, surrounding, and engulfing. There's no fucking way out. Right? That it's a vortex of invitations into bullshit conversations, frustrating labor, and the dead-eyed, soulless administrators who run these institutions. Police chiefs, executive directors, university and college presidents and chancellors, et cetera, judges, prosecutors, and sometimes people within our very own organizations and communities. So, yeah, okay, I guess we applaud that? Thank you, though. I appreciate being in community with you on these feelings, right? Because I think we kind of share them. I think we need to share them and politicize them instead of just feeling like they're isolated individual things. I think that's part of the reason I wanted to voice it. So it's to some extent, it is a feeling of inescapability, a sense of being drowned. That's what it feels like to me in some ways, like a feeling of being drowned in the liberal progressive counterinsurgency that often takes the form of invitations to join institutional operations in order to legitimize those institutional operations with your black, brown, feminist, queer, disabled, formerly incarcerated, and even abolitionist preference. So, we got that feeling, we understand what it is. I want to say that feeling is an indulgence. It is a characteristically and depressingly academic one at that. If there's one primary method that shapes the black liberationist stream of abolition, it is collective escape, or more pointedly, the refusal to surrender to the logics of inescapability. So I'm saying we share, we politicize those feelings, while at the same time, kind of honoring and being instructed by this particular stream of the abolitionist and black radical tradition. So I ask that we constantly learn from and be critically guided by this black liberationist stream of abolition when we think collectively about how we may be experiencing in real time a composite of liberal progressive appropriations and domestications of abolition that work within the logics of counterinsurgency. This is to think more closely about how the terms of abolition may be stolen, twisted, and deformed in ways that work to actively criminalize and demoralize forms of activity that are devoted to advancing the destruction imperative of abolition, of which I'll say more in a moment. Here I reference and work within Robert Allen's brilliant analysis in Black Awakening in Capitalist America, which he wrote as an on-the-ground organizer, researcher, and journalist during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Professor Allen teaches us how this stream of counterinsurgency works through electoral and policy campaigns, piecemeal institutional initiatives, including government, corporate, and academic initiatives, opportunistic philanthropic and foundation entrepreneurialism, and grift-friendly grant funding structures that attempt to bolster specific organizations and individuals as the generally domesticated representatives of various grassroots mobilizations, including those that threaten to become committed anti-state insurgencies. Professor Allen's book helps to frame what I'm attempting to identify as an emerging liberal progressive counterinsurgency bloc. And this is a big shout out to Jared Ware. Can you stand up, Jared? Jared and his co-host Josh, they invited me to talk about this concept, the liberal progressive counterinsurgency bloc. They invited me to talk about this on their now famous viral millions of subscribers, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is required listening all the time. And not because I've gotten to be on it twice. Not just, yeah, Ori Sharif, that's right, Ori's there. So the people in the room that have been on, okay, you get it. So listen to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism if you don't already. So thank you. This is partly coming from that conversation. And I want to build a concise working conceptualization of the liberal progressive counterinsurgency bloc by focusing on three of its primary dimensions. First is the institutional bloc. I want to give some time to this one the most. This is the dynamic ensemble of the people and organizational forms that I've already mentioned. The institutional block includes academics, by which I mean individual researchers who have an entrepreneurial relationship to scholarship through university foundation and state funding. Following Robert Allen's analysis, this block encompasses as well nonprofit and non-governmental organizations, especially those with ties to liberal philanthropic foundations. And by liberal in this case, I intend to characterize the social and political agendas of foundations like Ford, Mellon, Gates, etc., as well as these foundations' attachment to liberal personhood as the premise of the anthro within philanthropy. Right? I know some of y'all are etymology nerds, like sometimes it's helpful to figure that out. So this is to further emphasize how philanthropic foundations themselves play a central role in the advances of liberal progressive counterinsurgency. There is an abundant archive of evidence that shows how foundation administrators and officers, including McGeorge Bundy, who's in that photo with that collage that Abolition Journal created with Dan Walker. There's an abundant archive of evidence that shows how foundation administrators and officers scramble to shift and insinuate their agendas with and against upsurges of movement, insurgency, radicalism, and disruption that have been emerging and multiplying across various geographies and taking various forms over these last 15 years or so. So here I'm thinking, of course, of the insurgent communities and mobilizations of people in the places I already mentioned, and which include many other places like Standing Rock, Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit, Alabama State Prisons, Adelanto Detention Center, shout out Cynthia, and other sites that have created different examples of autonomous community based on creative disruption and destruction of the ideas and infrastructures of the social or social order, or peace for that matter, that philanthropy desperately intends to preserve. The second dimension of the liberal progressive counterinsurgency is the ideological block. By this I mean much more than the broad, usually unspoken agreement that the outermost limit of militant change-oriented activity is institutional reform, couched in increasingly empty phrases like systemic change, right? That's everywhere. Everything's systemic change. Institutional transformation, maybe not quite as common, but also fucking everywhere. Defund the police, which is at this point been totally emptied out of its original kind of abolition. Like, it's actually been turned counterinsurgent at this point. Defund the police is literally being used to refund the police and to expand the police. You get it. And of course, the now meaningless term, completely meaningless term, in fact, maybe dangerous term, social justice.
Oh, yeah.
So again, trace the genealogy of the term social justice and like let it rock your world about how that term has been turned into something opposite of what it used to mean. So I'm also talking about a policing of imagination, most importantly perhaps, a policing of imagination, a policing that surveils and attempts to undermine the fantastic and wild possibilities of world remaking that are already present in various forms of revolt and insurgency against the state, and for that matter, against civilization, as the ongoing genocidal, anti-Black, and colonial global project. That's the second component of the block, is the ideological block. And third, and most concisely, there's the militarized political block, which of course includes elected officials, state administrators, university and college administrators, staff, and yes, faculty, city councils, political action groups, et cetera, that are actively coordinating with police and their surrogates. So, this working definition of liberal progressive counterinsurgency is also necessarily an analysis of how reformism, different than reform, I'm saying reformism, is a primary technology of counterinsurgency in the contemporary and current moment. For folks familiar with Field Manual 324, this is like kind of no shit Sherlock, right? But for folks that are not as familiar with the Field Manual, I mean, it is an important thing to just learn, that reformism is central to counterinsurgency. Here I want to be explicit about defining reformism in direct relation to counterinsurgency. So defined generously, reformism is a broad ideological and political position that works from the compulsory assumption that existing institutions and relations of power must be protected, adjusted, and sustained, rather than completely transformed, eradicated, and abolished, or creatively destroyed and repurposed. The reformist position generally works from a similarly unstated consent to the forms of violent state power that criminalize, punish, and incarcerate those who engage in activities that explode the limits of reform. Under the tyranny of liberal progressive, oh, by the way, the latter point is why it is that so many reformist movements, especially when they get engaged in mass demonstrations, are really easy to disrupt and infiltrate, right? It's precisely because of the religious, kind of proto-religious, pseudo-religious adherence to notions of incrementalism and nonviolence, and also protecting things, institutions like property, institutions and flesh, such as those of the powerful. is precisely because organizations and movements adhere to that pseudo-religion. It's so easy for the state and other far-right organizations to just send one or two people to that demonstration to fuck things up, right? And they do it by engaging in those forms of property destruction, and attack and whatnot, right? So it disrupts things really easily. So I want to say that under the tyranny of liberal progressive counterinsurgency and the programs of reformism, reform is understood as the primary, if not exclusive, method of social change and justice. Perhaps more importantly, reform also engages in policing the imaginative, aesthetic, and epistemic horizons of collective efforts to abolish prisons, police, so-called child welfare, borders, and other expressions of asymmetric domestic war. Reformism defers, avoids, and frequently criminalizes efforts to catalyze fundamental change to an existing order, often through dogmatic and simplistic mandates of nonviolence, incrementalism, and compliance to the law and various notions of civility and respectability. While abolitionist, revolutionary, and black radical forms of collective analysis and movement frequently create irreconcilable confrontation with oppressive institutions and systems, reformism, make no mistake, seeks to preserve social, political, and economic orders by modifying isolated aspects of their operation. A peculiar assertion animates this liberal progressive counterinsurgency through reformism, that the long historical systemic asymmetries of violence produced by existing systems are the unfortunate consequences of fixable inequities, disparities, unconscious or implicit biases, corruptions, and or inefficiencies. So I'm tired of that shit. I'm really tired of it. I can't take that anymore. In this sense, reformism presumes that equality, equity, and parity are achievable and even desirable within existing systems, including the United States of America. Notably, the U.S. military's own counterinsurgency field manual is entirely compatible with reformism to the extent that reformism actively works to protect and renew the legitimacy of the state, especially among those questioning and contesting its legitimacy. Recall a component of the passage I read earlier in which Field Manual 324 defines counterinsurgency as creating a holistic approach aimed at weakening the insurgents while simultaneously bolstering the government's legitimacy in the eyes of the contested population. So the question I want to raise generally, but to this crowd in particular, this community in particular, is whether this description of counterinsurgency is precisely what much academic research and curricula, as well as university and nonprofit, as well as NGO-based forms of organizing campaigns, are actually doing, even as we earnestly attempt to work as abolitionists, scholars, teachers, organizers, artists, and activists. Put another way, there seem to be divergent strains of abolition that include self-nominated abolitionist practices and projects that have the effect and sometimes the intention of legitimizing the state or government rather than destabilizing and delegitimizing it. Consider, for example, how police departments and district attorneys' offices have at this point fully appropriated and institutionalized deformed models of transformative justice, while other state institutions have periodically even referred to their own criminal justice and policing work as somehow fucking abolitionists. This is going down, like it's real, and I know that y'all heard it. So in the spirit of a collective incitement, we may need to consistently, collectively, dynamically define abolitionist struggle and praxis, including study, teaching, and research, by naming what that struggle and praxis are for and against. Right? I'm all for strategic dichotomies, y'all. Like, I know that makes me a bad person, but I'm all about, I'm down to name some enemies now and then. Primarily because I want to embrace and love my allies and my comrades, right? But I think that means you got to name some fucking enemies. Not everybody's a friend. Returning to George Jackson's analysis of U.S. fascism and cultivation of insurgency in the direction of Black liberationist revolution, I offer one more passage from his 1972 text that I've appropriately revised and updated to reflect an ongoing half-century of feminist and queer interventions. From Blood My Eye again. Students, activists, and displaced people must work toward developing the unity of the pamphlet and the silenced pistol. Black, brown, and white are all victims together. At the end of this massive collective struggle, we will uncover our new human, the unpredictable culmination of the revolutionary process. They will be better equipped to wage the real struggle, the permanent struggle after the revolution, the one for new relationships between humans. That's from page 113. And I want to indicate and highlight how Jackson talks about the permanent struggle after the revolution. Following George Jackson, and for that matter, Safia Bukhari, Rochelle McGee, Lolita Lebron, Leonard Peltier, and numerous others in the tradition of abolitionists, Black liberationists, anti-colonial practitioners, The shared responsibility of confronting counterinsurgency is a permanent struggle for new relationships with human and non-human life, with the concept of power, with autonomous and self-determined ways of being, and with land. This permanent struggle militantly honors, protects, and advances the abolitionist streams emerging from the poetic, theorized, and embodied praxis of disabled, trans, decolonial, indigenous, feminist, black liberationist, unhoused, sex worker, politically imprisoned, and socially criminalized peoples. Yet make no mistake that this permanent struggle also means working within and through abolition's destructive creative imperative. Destructive creative imperative. To work within this imperative is to understand abolitionist destructivity, including but not limited to mobilized destruction of ideas, institutions, and relations of violence as the condition for a creativity that overwhelms and obsoletes this long-running genocidal world-deforming civilization project. By the way, I don't know that I'll survive that. I'll be real. Like, I don't know that, I mean, in a sense, both physiologically, but I don't know that I'm ready for that. I was having lunch with a couple of y'all saying, like, when that shit happens, you might have to limit me to just run in the re-education camps for the former cops, right? Like, I don't know that I'm actually equipped to be free like that, but I want to get there with it, you know? The destructive creative imperative of abolition demands relation, if not intimacy, with the multiple diasporic streams of black liberation that constantly inform, contradict, diverge from, and even correct other overlapping liberationist orientations. Yet, if abolition is not reducible to a destination outcome or individualized identity, then it also suggests a horizon of the unknown, perhaps a speculative futurity, or even what might be provisionally called an alter futurity, that exceeds what different groups and traditions reference as revolution. Of course, many of us like the idea of revolution, and we may insist on periodically using the language of revolution to describe and animate specific projects of overthrow and transformation. Provisional alter futurity does not replace revolution. It may, however, engulf it. The notion of alter futurity deviates from some, if not most, notions of futurity because it lingers in the imagination of altered being, a state of existing and thriving in insurgency and insurrection that does not concede autonomy, but rather performs autonomy in ways that may not be entirely coherent or even recognizable to the discourses and institutions, including academic colonizations of knowledge and knowing, that have been so violently formed in conquest and shadow warfare that is the perpetual civilization project. And I give you these images just to honor some of the people who I think exemplify alter being: Dr. Gita, Leonard Peltier, Rochelle McGee, Sophia Bukhari, Luisa Lebroni. Alter being inhales the smoke of the burning plantation and police station, shout out Minneapolis, as a toxic seeding of collective invincibility, an embrace and epistemic intimacy with vulnerability to violence and fungibility that thrives in the radical disruption, if not the dismantling, of the settler slaver's flesh, brick and mortar, and presumed bodily integrity in all its forms. Here's the speculation, often disciplined and purposefully misrecognized as irresponsible activity, adventurism, accelerationism, and pathologized, vulgarized notions of, quote, anarchy. By the way, I like anarchy. I'm down with anarchy. So I'm just talking about how people vulgarize that term because they have no idea what it actually is. Folks that, and also folks who accuse these forms of activity as jeopardizing the community, whatever community they're referring to, by provoking or inciting state violence. Of course, many in the community will respond that the violence has long been there. Right. It's always been liquidating and demoralizing, if not actually genocidal. And the smoke of the plantation and police station are more a celebration of possibility than an omen of oncoming repression. The repression was always inevitable because the evidence and archives show that it's the primary method of civilization to begin with. Abolition in this kind of place is alter futurity beyond, against, and after the civilization project that is driven by asymmetries of misery and suffering. More immediately, the activities are insurgency, revolt, imagination, study, abolition, collective defense, and community. These activities are a gateway drug to harder things, defying some recent academic, philanthropic, nonprofit, and state-crafting expropriations and rebrandings of abolition as funding stream, career path, and voluntaristic public-facing identity. The creative destructive imperative of abolition may mean losing or severing organizational, epistemic, and ideological attachments to the guarantees of certain kinds of sociality and order that are inscribed on both institutions and our very attachments to the whole concept of institutionality, from institutionalizations of the state and sexuality to citizenship and subjectivity. I know that's a mouthful. I can talk more about it in our discussion, Q&A. Let me conclude. The wildness that slips and escapes the coherence of the institution, the agenda, the program, and the plan, is the provisional alter futurity within which there are already exemplars of alter being. This is present tense, as it is also speculatively futurist, because if there's one thing among many that Black liberationists and abolitionist artist practitioners have demonstrated, it is that the white world's compartmentalization of temporality, its segregation of past from present, not only makes no fucking sense, it is a primary technology of genocide, anti-Blackness, and conquest. Lingering the abolition imperative, there's a persistent and endless collectively reimagined objective that is a mirage or collective dream of something on the other side of tyranny and terror, a something that slips and escapes definitive description, even it must actively be saturated with insurgent people's audacious, wild, autonomous imaginations. I'm grateful for your attention. So we're done, we can go now?
We do have time for questions. Anyone want to start?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you because I'm a student currently. I live in Baltimore with my family, but during the academic school year as a college student, I live at Hood College, Frederick, Maryland, predominantly white institute, very small minority population. Black students make up the majority. For the most part, I'd say it's Black staff and faculty, as well as students who make the school what it is for at least the student culture.
Yeah.
But of course, the mainly white administration tries to shut us down any way we can, even with simple, student-led activities, encouraging Black culture, Black community, communication across, student organizations, any way to shut us down they can. So one thing that's constantly been perpetuated through it is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusivity. I'm wondering at UCDC how prevalent that is and
Look at
the responses to
wall.
that.
You want to know about DI? Look at the pictures, like take a tour around this building and check out the photos on the wall, right? In time to leave them up there. Don't change them. That's what I think that's a lesson. Like that's a DEI lesson. The kind of the crafting of the visual presentation of this very building and the purpose of UCDC before time, of course. This is some CIA type shit, right? Like it's wild, but it's also deeply multicultural. It's extremely DEI. I would say first of all that I hope you get to know and be introduced to a lot of the friends, comrades, loved ones, scholars, teachers in the area that you can hook up with so that you don't feel so isolated. So Professor Ori Burton's right next to you. He's right there in the red. Professor Jared Ball, I think, might come through tomorrow at some point. And there's a bunch of folks in the area that are, there's grad students here from GW that I've met. There's all kinds of folks. So I want you to build community with them. So that changes everything. That's kind of my response to what you just said. Is that the way universities work is they work like plantations, right? They work from a logic of relative isolation, and they especially treat Black students that way, right? But Black students and people who are in affinity to Black students get treated with the same logics of isolation. But the dangerous thing for the administrators is they sometimes presume that their isolation works. So watch how they fucking freak out when you bring people to the campus from outside, like Dr. Burton, Dr. Ball, etc. on forward. Right? As soon as these outside eyes get put on the plantation, I guarantee the power relationship will change. The way they talk to you, their demeanor will change, all that stuff will change. And that's how you partly destabilize counterinsurgency. Because counterinsurgency is also very flimsy. As much as it's creative and dynamic and they do that shit, it's really, I'm not gonna say it's easy, but it is possible to analyze and tactically and strategically figure out how to destabilize counterinsurgency. So I think you're talking about that in real time. I hear you.
There's lots of hands, but I thought this first.
Hi, my name is Alejandro Anguiano. I'm actually a student here at the UCDC program, and everything that you're saying, it makes sense, and that's something that I've been doing my best to be local. And even here right now, I look around, I'm like, why isn't there more students from the program itself sitting here? And I don't know, I think this is the first time that I feel like I belong here, because I look around the room and there's people that look like me. So I appreciate everything you're saying.
All right then. Peace. Appreciate you.
And then it's left Grace and then Rob. So Make my way.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I want to say I thought it was real important you made a point how you would need to define and name the enemies.
Yeah.
Very, very important. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, but I work in the field. We actually work to get people out of the prison. That's part of abolition, right? But we take no monies from the government. We take no funding from government, DOC, DOJ. And I remember I actually had a young lady who does a group prison. She said, Tom, if we talk like how y'all talk, we wouldn't get no money.
That's right.
Because when we go up and talk, we say these are descendants of the enslaved Africans that's brought here. This is racism, white supremacy. And so we have to be careful. You can't be sitting at the same table and eating and breaking bread with people who are oppressor, who are incarcerated. We had to come out one coalition because they had put in there as part of the head a person who was a former DOC award. That's reform. That's not abolition. And if you get too close to them, they will absorb you, and you'll be working to maintain a system of white supremacy in another 400 years. So we have to define and name who's who. No, I'm not interested in going to the White House, sitting down with nobody. Not interested in going to be in your video. Don't want to be in your song. We need to get these people out of prison. We need to dismantle this. And so sometimes we think we're a part of dismantling, but we're actually reinforcing.
That's exactly right.
And so that's not, even groups within the grassroots are working against your work. You know, taking money, funded, and those grants sometimes are bribes. Because once you take the money, you will not talk about them and incriminate them the way you did before you didn't take the money.
Yeah.
So those grants are bribes. And so we have to be mindful and be analytical, because you could be next to the person, you're reinforcing, you're making the job harder for what we're trying to do. We have to go into a new world. Our children deserve something better, and they cannot live in this world anymore.
We deserve something better.
We deserve
Get the
something.
children.
But right now, we in this world, it ain't better. But the next ones do. But I got what you're saying. It's a Bia Bakari. Everybody need to read that book, The War Before.
Oh yeah, that's the part. So let me add to that. Let me say two things. One is that it's so deep for all of us that are employed by universities and go to annual conferences at different times, right? And you know, we'll go to American Studies Association, we'll go to whatever. So I told the story to a few already. 3 weeks or so ago, I went to there's the annual meeting of the Association for Asian American Studies, which is largely compiled. A lot of the folks that go to that conference would be totally at home right here, right? It's a pretty decent organization. But the minute I walked up to that registration desk, I saw 10 people dressed in West Point uniforms at the registration desk. So of course, me being me, I was pissed. And I was like, these fuckers are here to recruit people, right? So like I went up to them, I said, what are you here for? Right, all hostile and everything, right? And they were like, oh, we're here. They were like young people, because I kind of felt a little bad, because they were like 18, 19. I was like, what are you doing here? I was like, what are you doing here? And they said, we're here, we're part of the conference. And they showed me their fucking name badges. They're like, we're here to learn, they said. They said, we are here to learn.
Oh, God.
They're here to learn. And then their commanding officer, who of course was the white guy, he was actually on a panel as a presenter. Right, so when we talk about how this is working and sitting at the same table, like these folks, get ready for all your organizations that you're part of. Like there's going to be folks in the military in uniform going to your conferences and sitting with you sitting in the audience, right? And I gave like a short version of some of the stuff I was saying up here. And there's one young person from West Point in uniform sitting right in front of me, and I felt a little bad, but I had to troll her the whole time. Right? Because I was like, oh my God, yeah, I'm talking about y'all. Like, y'all made this. Y'all made this field manual. Yeah.
Somebody, she was an organizer, helped get people out. She worked for the governor's office of reentry, loved that. She actually got a job with DOC high up. She had to leave.
Yeah.
You told her she had to leave because you are now working.
Yeah.
So this is how serious you have to be about the work you do. She's like, oh.
Yes, and let me just say, like, thank you for the comment you made, because what you also help remind all of us of is that study is a central component of any serious abolitionist praxis. And I mean study in a collective sense, right? I'll say that this one coalition that I joined, I don't think there's anyone else here that's part of it right now, but it's called Inland Empire Decarcerate Coalition. It's composed of a whole bunch of reentry folks, former incarcerated people, people from all of us are known, the national organization, current former students, underground scholars initiative people, etc. And the thing I appreciate about being invited into that coalition is that that community of folks makes no bones that they want to take advantage of my privileged skill set You know what I mean? Because I went to school, I read all this shit, like I teach all these classes. So they're like, no, so, and I'm like weirdly apologetic about it, you know? Because I'm like, yeah, you know, I don't know if I belong in this coalition, I don't know if I should be voting on stuff. I'm in a bunch of organizations, but I don't represent any of them. I'm just, and they're like, no, just shut up. And like, they asked that 2 weeks ago, they had me do a presentation on Robert Allen's book. Right, so they're like, okay, we think we get what you're saying about the nonprofit industrial complex and how bad it is if we just kind of fall into the default mechanisms and the default political practices of the nonprofit. But like, could we do like maybe an hour at our next meeting just talking about that history? And so we did. It was a collective study. We read 9 pages from Black Awakening in Capitalist America. That was more than enough. Everyone learned who McGeorge Bundy was. Right? Everyone there would be prepared to know who Darren Walker was. You feel me? So, but like, it's now guiding our collective work. Right, so the study is the praxis, and I'll say that we've got to take that seriously. And I think that's one thing I'll say I'm happily embracing in this period is I think there's a lot more, you know, kind of hunger to do the collective study than maybe in previous iterations of U.S.-based activism and coalition type work.
Okay. Well, you know, we don't have that much time. I can yield to if like there's any young people that want to ask a question.
Ask the question, Sheree. Maybe we'll collect like
Okay.
2 and you can.
Okay, it's kind of, so, hello? So I just wanted to know, oh my gosh, I just wanted to know if you had heard of this term irregular warfare.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I sent you this little document because I'm like,
Thank you.
irregular warfare, it combines like the asymmetric approaches you were
Right.
talking about, and then it's like a whole bunch of other shit, including counterinsurgency, destabilization, foreign internal defense, etc. And I wondered if that fits into like your framework, and if you could just talk a little bit about that, because it's basically teaming up, state and non-state actors teaming up to like, for constructing consent, right, all around the world. And they're saying like the enemies of the U.S., like China and Iran and blah, 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 are using against the U.S. And the U.S. hasn't been using irregular warfare effectively.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So I'll say like, as I keep writing this thing, yeah, I got to bring that whole, thank you for sending me that, I appreciate that. So like, I'll be referencing you and your work as well. But I'll say this, you got me thinking as well about how, I think there's a need to reframe the January 6th situation.
Period.
Okay, I think that's actually irregular warfare in generalized coordination with the logic of the state, right? Even though the state came down on it, called, you know, selectively named it treason or whatever, you know, we all know that folks knew what was coming that were part of the state, right? So I know that part of the group we're in, the Portal Project. I remember like during one of the sessions, I was arguing that the problem with January 6th should not be naming the lack of police action against it, right? Because January 6th was a police action.
Well, Jenny Thomas is one of the primary funders, the
Thank
wife
you.
of Clarence Thomas.
That's
and all
right.
of these billionaires.
That's irregular warfare.
Yeah.
That's exactly what, so that the messiness that irregular warfare brings to the table is like crucial. Yeah, but that kind of messes up how clean this concept was in this case. Irregular warfare is where it's at. I'm with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm still letting all of this marinate and process in my mind. So I'm just trying to think if you have, you know, any further thoughts on the way that alter futurity in practice can happen in times when folks are in prison, are in survival mode, in crisis. So just, you know, I want to hear more about how that's sort of practiced in our everyday lives.
I'll be real with you. I'm not sure I'm qualified to do that. But and I'll say this, when I use this term alter futurity, alter being, whatever, it's a guess. Straight up, like I'm guessing. Like I'm trying to find a way to refer to something without naming it in some kind of compartmentalized, defining way. I'm saying there's a tendency. Sorry, I'm saying there's a tendency. You understand what I'm saying? Like, and I can't define it because I'm not in that mode of being. But I think I've experienced it in moments, right? And I can talk about that. Right? I can talk about moments where, you know, I'm with people that are in a direct, either confrontation or direct fugitivity from some form of institutional violence and state power. We're doing like illicit, maybe even illegal shit, which I can talk to you offline. but like the way that we exist, the relationships we have, you know what I'm saying, and even like the forms of intellectual rigor and theorization and then planning that we do is completely different than what happens when we're not in that state, right? And so I'm saying like, when I think of this is what I wrote about a while back when I was thinking about the hunger strike in Pelican Bay that lasted years and years and years and years, right? I think for the most part that was an example, kind of an exemplary, protracted example of that, because those folks who are in the security housing units, I've been corresponding with one person, to Shiri Ascari, right to him. He's now out of the chute. But I wrote to him for probably 15 years. I met him when he was in the security housing unit already. So I wrote to him for 15 years, and that was my one contact. And I got to visit him once. And I got to meet the late Hugo Yogi Pinel, right, Vicente. So those folks who inhabit those positions, that's altered being. Right? That's like a way of being in the world that we cannot access that. You see what I mean? I can't even really describe it. Right? I can describe what I experienced through them, but I know that they're in a different place than me, right? And I think, and also their thoughts and their creativity and the way they saw the world was also some shit that altered how I thought about stuff. That's why I use the term alter. Because I think when I say alter, I'm guessing at something, I'm pointing at a tendency, and I'm also saying that it actually alters the way I think about being. It alters the way I think about futurity. Now I gotta push back against all the people I love and work with that insist on having some kind of guarantee in what we're doing. That's great, except we also have to embrace there not being a guarantee that there's some shit that just happens. And that there's actually possibility there. And planning can happen out of that, right? But we can't access that unless we're in it. So that's a long way of saying I can't answer your question.
Just a quick moment. I don't want to rush this rich Q&A. And so we are going to push back the workshop sessions to 3:30 because there's a break after that. So we can keep this going. All right.
I thought I was off the hook.
With your permission.
Of course.
So thank you so much for this talk. I think that the use of the field manual was just brilliant. There's so much power and things that can be generated from your framework. I have one question about the framework though. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to imply that the objective of abolition is nation building. And if that's the case, given the use of revolution, your joke about the re-education camps, I ask this question because that makes me a bit concerned about the proclivities of revolutions to reproduce deeply patriarchal and heteronormative structures.
Yeah. So I would say it depends which stream of abolition we're embracing, and also which concept of nation we're working with, right? So that's when I say civilization throughout this talk, I meant it with a capital C. I'm talking about that project. And then of course there's all kinds of other coexisting and insurgent projects that maybe you could provisionally call a work of civilization, but it's actually indigenous work. You know what I mean? It's liberation work. So nation building can mean lots of shit, right? So I'll say that I honor there's a particular Black radical tradition of nation building, which at this point has been thoroughly inflected and altered and critiqued and reconstituted in many ways by Black radical feminism, Black queer thought, etc. So there's that, right? There's of course indigenous, aboriginal, and tribal forms of nation building, which again, not that that's not also vulnerable to the same heteropatriarchy and and trans and queer phobia, etc. So I take a kind of promiscuous approach to that question, and I don't think. I'll need to reread my comments and edit what I'm writing, because I don't mean to imply that abolition is, I don't mean to imply that abolition is a kind of compulsory move toward nation building at all. So I appreciate that you reflected that back. I'll also say that I'm increasingly embracing the ways that abolition is entirely compatible with variations of both communism, radical libertarianism, and anarchist autonomy. Right, so there's all kinds of shit going on within abolitionist streams that are completely contrary to the nation concept, right? So, again, I take a promiscuous approach to all that. I think it's good and necessary to hash all that out, yell at each other about it. I'm all for it. If that's where we're at, then we're in a good place. It means that we're inhabiting a position where civilization's actually gonna fall.
All right, thank you. It's clear you live in a capitalist system. So all the various institutions of society are obviously designed to maintain the current social structure. So the idea, if you go to a university, it's designed to reproduce that social structure. You work in nonprofit that has the same purpose. So, I mean, my thought is you have to build an organization which is separate from the capitalist structures. You have to build an independent organization that has a vision of what a future society should be like. To me, that future society is a communist society without racism, without a wage system, without all these, isms that, dehumanize us. So, I mean, you talked a lot and you said a lot of things. I'm kind of old, so you went very fast. I'm not sure if I got it all, but I want to know.
That was on purpose, so you would.
Right. I'm exercising my privilege here, but ageism. But no, I want to know where do you think about the necessity of building our own organization separate from all these other groups, structures that the capitalists set up for us? Even this conference, I mean, UCDC is a capitalist institution. It has certain purposes, but what do we do in terms of building our own organization, which is going to tear this system down and build a new society?
So my short answer is yes.
Good. So therefore, you should now join the Progressive Labor Party.
I'm great for that. And on top of that, on top of the recruitment pitch, I'm also going to paraphrase my good friend and comrade Dean Spade, who is all about proliferation. Right? It's all about proliferation. Now, I'm about proliferation in antagonism with racial capitalist order. Right? So when I say proliferation, I'm not condoning bullshit. I'm saying proliferation of all different practices of autonomy and antagonism within and against the racial capitalist order. That's what I'll say. Proliferation.
So first and foremost, thank you very much. I don't think I've been in a space before where somebody kind of like gave it to Ford like that. So that. But yeah, like
it felt good.
Yeah, it felt good to hear it too. But I'm from a nonprofit, and so just being able to see so many foundations carry all of our stories, documentations, and just like, oh yeah, we don't believe in school to prison pipeline. Then it's like, hey, we got this money for school to prison pipeline because it's hot and sexy right now, right? Yeah. And so I just want to thank you, because not only that, but like in a short amount of time, you're also like that word that we've been using from mass incarceration to everything else. I'm like, wait, hold on, where is the vocabulary? We need this. Like, it's much needed right now. And just to be realistic, yeah, we're right here in their backyard. And they have all our information. They knew we were here when we came through the airport and the train stations. They knew us from when we were marching, and they know us while we write our books. And so my word from you as somebody who's inside, right, what are some of the things that you have for not just the educators in the room, but really for the young people in the room, right, who are literally targeted, right? They're the ones who they're really looking into to kind of like soak in what they're trying to dish out and pretend that they're for us. So like, what would be your message for those young people? That's all.
I'll say this. I work at University of California, right? And as I told you all for a couple minutes there, right? Like I'm in that vortex, and it's significantly overlapping with the nonprofit apparatus. The more I talk to people who I'm really close to, who are part of the nonprofit apparatus in different ways, and are also like always fighting against it. I'll say this. I think there's both an existing tendency that I can see and an actual kind of blueprint to momentarily kind of infiltrate some of these organizations. I think it's only appropriate to do that if you're infiltrating based on a kind of charge or set of assignments that you're taking from a collective, or otherwise it's about you, right? But I think, okay, I'll give you an example. I'm co-directing a humanities center at my campus right now, right? And the primary reason why I'm doing it, I'm in my second year doing it. The primary reason why I'm doing it is because I took marching orders, basically, from a collective of people, many of whom are, employed by the university also, but many of whom are not, who understood my objections to doing it, right? Understood that I was going to be miserable in some ways, like working with the administration and whatnot, but said, no, your job is to do this because you'll get access to a modest amount of funding, and then your job is to distribute that funding to people who actually need it. So it's like, it's a small assignment. I'm not saying that that's anything more than what it is, right? But I'll say the same thing about the nonprofit industrial complex and penetrating the foundations and philanthropic apparatus, right? If you can have an assignment that says like, we're gonna go into this thing as a program officer, we're gonna coordinate and fund that organization, we're gonna work with that organization to write like a proposal that fits within the thing, and then we're gonna make it unrestricted funds, right? That's an assignment that you can take with you. So there's ways, so like people, and by the way, I'm saying this because I'm learning this from people who are in it, right? So I'm saying that practice, and again, it's a momentary infiltration, because then you fucking leave, because either that or they're gonna fire you. Right, because there's a board, right? There's a board, and sometimes, you know, you fuck up the 501c3 status, or they think you are, or whatever. So it's momentary, so you have to like be ready to kind of move. But I'm saying you only get to do that if you are empowered and you're riding on the strength of some kind of collective that has also got your back, right? Because like when I give you the example of what I'm doing, that same collective said, if you quit, we got your back anytime you want, right? If you can't take anymore, just quit, right? So like, ironically, they know how I work, so like, as soon as they gave me permission to quit, they knew I was gonna try to like, prove them wrong by just taking shit all the time, right? So I'm like, oh, y'all think I can't take this shit. I'm gonna like eat shit every day to the point where like, you won't even, you know what I mean? Like, you don't admire me for taking, so, but it's working out, right? Like we were able to put together an honorarium for Sekou Odinga. Baba Sekou Odinga came to UC Riverside for the first time, like in February. Riverside does not deserve him, and I told him that. And that's my introduction to him. My introduction to Baba Sekou was like, UC Riverside does not deserve you, but we do. You know, so I was able to, you know, make sure that we support Sekou Odinga because that's how he makes his living nowadays, right? Same thing, we're looking forward with everything, you know, health permitting, everything else. We're looking forward to supporting Baba Matulu Shakur coming to our campus in a couple of weeks. That's what I'm saying. It's like a small contribution to that work, but I'm saying that's my assignment, right? In that vein. So that's what I would say about that. Like I think you have a mission, and also you be in community with people outside your organization and institution. Right, because like, when I got the death threat type shit, and I did that because I was siding with Palestinians, right? And like, you know, the Zionists comfort you, right? Like, I was their flavor of the day that day, because I was part of some Twitter storm, and I was like talking about Zionism in like a bad way, you know? I had all these death threats and stuff, and like a collective right away called an emergency meeting because they were worried about me. And they're like, how you doing? I'm like, I fucking feel invincible because like y'all, they gotta go through you all first. You know what I mean? And like they knew I meant it, so I actually didn't feel endangered at all because I was with them. So I'd say the same thing about the advice that you're asking for. It's like that's when you actually feel a real sense of empowerment. That's not some bullshit neoliberal sense of empowerment. Like when it's coming from a collective, and the collective can be 5 people, right? Or it can be 500 people, right? But you feel that, and it's like that's empowerment because that's autonomous empowerment. To get back to that point.
I think we have time for one more question, and I saw your hand.
Hi. I think your presentation gave me a lot to think about, and I look forward to reading more of your work so I can continue reflecting on the questions you brought up. A question I have for you is, as somebody who's interested in working more in policy and attacking like certain aspects of the system that are actively harmful in this moment, while recognizing that the ultimate goal is abolition, how do you do that in a way that's sensitive to the fact that that could ultimately empower counterinsurgency? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, this is a great way to kind of like continue our conversation. So thank you for that question. Full transparency, like policy makes my eyes roll in the back of my head. So I need like help. So thank you. I look forward to like going to you for translation when I have to read policy because I have trouble. Yeah. I'll say this. I think we need to treat policy as the terrain of casualty management. Like in other words, if like I take the framework seriously that so many other people have put out there, and which I'm just trying to contribute to in these last few minutes, if I take the framework of counterinsurgency and domestic war seriously, and I take especially the kind of analysis of asymmetric casualties seriously, then policy is one of the primary leverage points through which you can at least manage casualties. Right, so just understand that the liberation not coming from policy, like most likely, unless some weird shit happens, right? But absolutely, immediately, urgently, and now, there can be ways to leverage policy, especially in localized conditions, to do the work of casualty management. That's what decarceration is. So yeah, casualty management.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
And actually,
Can you use the mic? I'm sorry.
Is this better?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So one of our colleagues brought this question up yesterday, just that some of these policies, and you brought this up, some of these policies that are brought forward can be leveraged in a way to actually harm the movement. So how do you, like as an activist, how can you try to support this movement in a way that's that doesn't accidentally cause more casualties?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to constantly revisit the archive of various movements, not just one movement, but various movements, and learn from those. I mean, shout out to Southern California Library for those folks in the LA area, you probably know it. Southern California Library, grassroots, autonomous hub of community organizing and knowledge making and art, and also they have an actual archive that's like unmatched. I go to the library, and Yusef Omawale and Michelle Wilson, who run it, all the time, to learn from them and their vast historical and archival knowledge about how a particular policy proposal that reads okay, right? It reads like it could work in favor of casualty management, and then they break down for me how it usually isn't, right? And they talk about, okay, here's what this really is. So you have to draw from this kind of collective sense of this collective expertise. And that's usually a locally grounded a set of like analysts, organizers, intellectuals, in this case, archivists and librarians. So that's what I would say. That's what I mean by the collective study piece. Right? I mean, you gotta be promiscuous about the collective study too. It's not just people within the organization. You gotta like call on people to help you. So I'll say that collective study, collective study, collective study.
Thank you.
Yes.
Let's go for a round of applause.